Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Prime and Load. My name is Lee Gugino, and we're here with Doctors Andrew Bamford and Alex Burns. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to answer some questions that we've gotten from our listeners. And so we're going to take a few episodes. We won't be able to do them all at once, but we're going to answer some now, and then in another episode, we'll answer some more. Our first question is from Ryan, and he asks, with the 250th anniversary here, how do Americans/colonists win their War of Independence? What does Washington do right to keep his army's head above water until victory conditions arrive? I'll toss that up, and whoever wants to grab that one and go.
Sure. Do you want to lead on this one, Andrew?
That feels like an Alex question, yeah.
All right. So, yeah, I mean, I would say broadly, with a lot of help, is how we win. I mean, that's a huge part of the victory conditions. But specifically, if we're not talking about the massive amount of aid we receive from the French and the Spanish and the Dutch, and generally in that order. Although some insane folks online who are really championing the cause of Spain will say maybe they gave us more than the French, and I'm not quite there myself. Obviously, both incredibly important. What do we do ourselves? What do the American Army, the Continental Army, how do we win the war? To some extent, we win it by not losing. We win the war by keeping the army together, keeping the army alive, and Washington is a very important part of that. Washington, and this may break some people's hearts, I hope not, Washington is not up there with the Napoleons and Frederick the Great and Maurice de Saxes of the sort of tactical genius or operational genius of the 18th century, or the 19th century, I guess, in Napoleon's case. But he is a very important symbolic leader and moral leader, and he's a very, I think, a kind of standard 18th century commander who's cautious in his thinking and always sort of has in mind, even if things go wrong, what am I doing to preserve the army in being? So initially, you have a strategy of prepared defense, where Washington is trying to hold positions, say around New York City or later around Philadelphia. I think later he seizes upon the idea of, man, we don't necessarily need to hold the cities, but maintaining the army itself in being as a symbol of resistance. That's actually how we're going to win the American War of Independence. Now, his exact tactic for, keeping the army together, avoid large-scale open battle if you think you're going to lose. I guess not very early, but in the first 3 years of the conflict, Washington risks a lot more open battles, and you have a huge number of sort of large field battles, the Germantowns and Brandywines and Long Islands of the American War of Independence. And speaking frankly, Washington doesn't do terribly well in those engagements. But later in the war, as he kind of develops as a strategist, he's very good at choosing secure defensive locations for his army camps. I think that's... I always tell my undergraduate students when I teach military history, Washington has two real gifts as a commander. The first is choosing these locations for entrenched camps, both at Morristown and at Valley Forge. I think we think of Valley Forge in sort of American legend and myth and Americana as like a place where it kind of sucked, a place where it was very hard to be a soldier. It was very cold, you didn't have shoes, you didn't have a lot to eat, and all that's true. It's also an incredibly important fortified camp that keeps the army safe and allows it to operationally maintain a position close to Philadelphia throughout that very difficult winter. Second, Washington is a great launcher of snap counterattacks. He does this very well in the what sometimes we call the 10 Crucial Days, the sort of Trenton-Princeton campaign. He also does this effectively, I think, effectively at the Battle of Germantown. It's not a tactical victory on the battlefield, but it's a very important step in the development of the Continental Army's morale and sense of a professional force that can fight the British on equal terms. There are sort of writers like Thomas Paine retreating off the battlefield with the American army after the Battle of Germantown, who say, man, we lost this fight, but it didn't seem like the army was beaten as we marched away. The guys were kind of hyped up. They were excited. They had attacked the British and seen British regulars kind of retreat in front of them. That was a very decisive moment in the development of the army's morale. Now, as the war goes on, it kind of, at least in Washington's case, directly being in command, it kind of transitions to a war of posts. Washington is sort of good at managing this. And so, again, it's not necessarily by being a Napoleonic style of leader searching for, where is the Kenai that we're going to annihilate the British army in the field. That's not really what Washington is trying to do. What Washington is trying to do is maintain an army in being, so eventually the British ministry will run out of money and ships and men and supplies, and that is what happens, combined with the large global war that the British are forced to contend with after the year 1778. So I would say he's not a great tactician. Washington leaves a lot to be desired in terms of his tactical leadership. But he is a man who has, I think, one of the right strategic visions for how to win the war. I think he's in some ways sort of a cautious man. This is not a bad commander-in-chief to have, especially as the war wears on and he's learning on the job, keeping the army alive as a symbol of rebellion and slowly wearing down British resources. Now, sort of a final note here. Washington himself is very disappointed in his performance. He really wants to go attack New York City. He wants to sort of he wants to attack Philadelphia in the winter of 77-78. He wants to decisively liberate these cities. That's something that is aspirational, but I think he has the measured confidence to know that's an aspirational goal that he doesn't always have the tools to achieve. And so, in my opinion, the greatest decision point of the war is in July of 1781, when Washington has the question, do I keep running down the path that I've been planning for the last 3 years and attack New York City, or do I march the army down to Yorktown to take advantage of that situation that's developing? And I think for a lot of us, we can read the war, from our perspective today, knowing that America is created, and say, well, yeah, obviously Yorktown's the better opportunity. That Yorktown is the better, advantage. It's an incredible opportunity. Imagine turning your back on 3 years of work. That's what Washington is doing. Washington has just begun the sort of a reconnaissance in force to attack New York City when the word comes that, hey, something's going on down in Virginia. And it does, I think, show a nimbleness or agility of mind that he says, I'm going to abandon this goal that I've had for the last 3 years and instead go down and seek this new opportunity in Virginia. So if I've disappointed listeners by talking smack at George Washington, hopefully, again, you've got to look at him measured as a commander. Is he a great tactician? No, but he's also the man who wins American independence with the help that we receive from the French and the Spanish and the Dutch.
I just have a slight comeback on that. This would maybe an extra sort of those horrible questions disguised as an observation or vice versa. But I mean, I guess we're still thinking on the thing that triggers the foreign aid is the victory at Saratoga, which obviously Washington isn't involved in. All right, Gates has got Arnold to help him. I don't know how that goes down well these days in America with his subsequent career, but between the two of them, they win a pretty impressive victory. Washington is lucky then at that point, it seems to me, because he can do all the things that you've outlined. He can wait for the French to distract the British war effort, and he can sit tight until help arrives. What does he do if Saratoga doesn't happen? Let's I mean, all right, the Albany plan was never going to work. Let's say Burgoyne extracts his army, falls back to Ticonderoga, even all the way to Montreal. It's a bit of a damp squib in the Northern Theatre. Does that mean Washington's pretty much going to have to attack Philadelphia before it's evacuated, or New York in short order, and take that risk? Or how does that figure? Because that seems the flaw in the strategy, that actually he benefits from a success elsewhere to be able to do what he does best.
I mean, I guess it depends in what manner Saratoga doesn't happen, right? So if there's no resistance on the Lake Champlain Hudson River corridor and Burgoyne just comes down to New York City, the British don't have the manpower to hold that chain of positions because Lord Howe has already taken the army down to Philadelphia. So it's never going to work unless the whole British army is deployed in that New York, New England theater. If Lord Howe doesn't go down to Philadelphia, then Washington's army is still kind of up in the New York operational area and probably is involved in the efforts to resist Burgoyne coming down. But let's suppose the exact question: Saratoga doesn't happen. Let's say the Battle of Freeman Farm occurs. It's a more decisive victory for the British than the kind of the slight eke out win stalemate that it was in the real world. Burgoyne is able to bring 5,000 additional troops down into New York City. That doesn't change the second kind of military rage that occurs as a result of the death of Jane McCrae. I mean, you still have an army of perhaps 14,000 men mobilizing on the Patriot side. Yeah, I mean, Saratoga is a very helpful crossover point, and again, this is going to be tough for those Washington fans out there. He's embarrassed by this. He's a little bit concerned that the army in Saratoga is winning the big victories and his army's not doing so well. I mean, this is in the, if you're of a particularly kind of patriotic mind, I think this is what you call the Conway Cabal, right? There's a potential effort to replace Washington as commander-in-chief and see Gates as sort of the principal hero of Saratoga. If Saratoga doesn't happen, the war probably takes longer. But I'll put my cards on the table. I'm in the Matthew Spring camp. I don't think our victory in the War of Independence was almost a miracle, as John Ferling has it. I think that once the shooting starts, the British ministry is in essentially the same position they were in Manila in the later 7 Years' War. They can control the area, essentially a musket shot around their camps, but they don't have the ability to conduct a real counterinsurgency campaign in a region as large and diverse as the 13 colonies. So, maybe they managed to sort of quash New England. I don't think there's a serious chance that the British have of retaining all of the 13 colonies once the fighting actually begins. They might retain key cities. They might retain portions of the 13 colonies. I do think that's a realistic goal. I think probably was something to the Southern strategy. But yeah, if Saratoga doesn't happen, yeah, Washington is in a bit more of a pickle. But I still think America becomes into, and I mean, the French are going to find a way into the war eventually. I mean, they're just looking for the opportunity to, put the stick in your eye, right? I mean, it's going to happen. I mean, wasn't there a crisis over the Falklands in like 68? Or maybe even more recent. I can't remember the exact date off the top of my head. But after you all, how can I say this politely, hurt everyone so badly in the peace deals after the 7 Years' War, so much. I mean, even the Dutch are waiting to sort of get revenge. Right? I mean, Britain basically is Johnny No-Mates at this point, right? I mean, even Frederick of Prussia hates you. It's a sad time to be British. In some ways, it's that makes the struggle after 78 so much more heroic from the British perspective. I love going to the National Army Museum in Chelsea and seeing that the War of Independence exhibit is mostly about the Siege of Gibraltar. I mean, it's a great period where sort of Britain's got its back up against the wall and, in my opinion, does surprisingly well in that second half of the war. But yeah, I think America's in some form or other kind of gone once the shooting actually starts.
No, I mean, I wouldn't dispute that. It was more a question about Washington, which you've answered. But yeah, absolutely, Pride coming definitely a long way before a fall as far as Britain in the 60s and 70s is concerned.
Okay, our next question comes from Wundergraf at whatever.com. They ask, were 18th century armies able to feed and shelter all their men? I always get the impression that it was less of a priority for commanders and that they took local population for food and shelter for granted.
Andrew, you want to have a go with this one?
Yeah, I'll dive in on that one. Yes and no, I suppose, is the very short answer. I mean, an awful lot is going to depend on where in the world we're talking about. And Alex, I'm sure will maybe want to come in on some of the North American stuff and perhaps some of the Prussian experience as well. There isn't an awful lot of Europe even that can support an army operating without magazines. Flanders, the Rhineland, northern Italy, the most sort of fertile, densely populated bits. So if you yes, you could live off the land. You can live off the land to an extent in those parts of the world. You might not make any friends by doing so, which is also a factor to bear in mind. But no, I mean, if you're campaigning elsewhere, even if you're campaigning somewhere like that, but don't wish to thoroughly hack off the locals, magazines, convoys, logistics support, it's absolutely all in place. Something like Marlborough shifting his army from Flanders into Bavaria, you can't do that without magazines set up and provision for bread ovens and all the things you need to feed tens of thousands of people in short order. Shelter, if you're going to be a soldier in the 18th century, you're going to spend a fair amount of time sleeping in the rain. I think that's a part of the soldier's life. Yes, there were tents. And if you could get your men under cover, you could. That made a difference. I mean, Culloden's the prime example there. You have a Jacobite army that slept out on an open moorland after a failed night march against a government army that's been snug in billets in a small town. And that's not the only reason why Cumberland's successful, but it sure helps on the day. So no, I think commanders made every effort they could to keep their men fed and supplied and sheltered. And when they didn't, I remember reading there's an excellent book by Padraig Lenihan. It's on armies and epidemics, but one of the chapters talks about marches, long marches that go wrong and end up with armies falling sick. And obviously, a key factor there is lack of food and provision. The example he gives is the Russians and the Austrians against the Turks in the 1730s when things really go quite badly wrong indeed. So yeah, get it right if you can, because if you get it wrong, it's not going to end well for you.
Yeah, I'd broadly agree with that. I mean, I would say a lot of recent research is even suggesting that just having armies kind of going ham and living off the land is not even really as common as we might imagine in the Napoleonic Wars. And so just kind of by way of how does this actually work in practice, you have large magazines, which are sort of storehouses for equipment and food. The majority of time, those stores are moved to the Army's location by water transport on barges as close as possible to the Army. Once they're offloaded into carts, sort of moved to the physical location of the Army. Yes, you are absolutely buying local food from where the Army is. You are requisitioning food, which basically means you're showing up in a village and saying, we'd like to buy all the food and we'll give you some sort of surety or some kind of currency in order to sort of basically pay for the stuff that we're taking. I mean, this is not so different from how even modern armies operate. I mean, when our forces in American forces, our NATO exercises in Germany in the 1980s, there's a little squad car that follows the tanks around. If the tank hits a building, you have to shell out cash and kind of pay for the damage that's done in the exercise, right? I mean, so do they sleep in tents a lot? Yes, absolutely. Do they sleep in the open a lot? Yes, absolutely. Are they also frequently in the winter kind of quartered in villages on the local population? Yes, that absolutely does happen, and villagers also don't necessarily love that. I mean, the armies do create challenges. And kind of the duality of man here in two Frederick the Great quotes about the impact of armies on the civilian population. Frederick the Great says, I don't want the peasants to even know that a war is happening because we're not disrupting their life and their economy at all. That's one quote you see often trotted out. The other is, Saxony is like an old sack. When you hit it, something always falls out. And so, like, again, there are, and Saxony is not part of the Prussian kingdom at this point, obviously. So it's foreign territory, occupied territory that he's stealing stuff from, like an old sack. But again, it's a little bit more complicated than they live off the land. It's a little bit more complicated than they always have logistical support on the vagaries of war in North America. One of the unique things there is, and German forces, for example, the Hessians and Braunschweigers in the War of Independence are horrified by this. There aren't mobile bread ovens that follow the armies. And so you're basically issued, like flour, and you have to sort of make your own dough and cook it in an earthen camp oven that your platoon has dug. And the Germans are scandalized by this, that there's not a bread issue, that instead it's a flour issue. A soldier in Burgoyne's army in the 1777 campaign writes, even the Russians who are fighting alongside the Tartars are issued bread, and we're not being issued bread here in North America. Like, this is truly the end of the earth. So it's again, different times, different places. The armies do have a huge amount of logistical apparatus that cover this.
All right, so our next question from SEI's contact at wedon'tcare.com. They're asking about the usefulness of spear weapons in the infantry in the 18th century. Many years ago, I participated in a discussion in which one of the participants said that its rejection was premature. From what I remember, de Sax and others favored its preservation, and they want to know what your guys' opinion is.
Yeah, I'm a de Sax fan. I do always wonder with that. I mean, some of this is from Reveries, which isn't necessarily Sax at his most rational sort of fever dream approach to military theory. It seems to me what you've got with Sax and Follard and that whole approach. Is it a genuine desire to bring back the pike? Is it more of a rhetorical device to say we want infantry to win battles by impetus and shock action rather than with linear firepower, which the French army isn't the best at, I think would be fair to say, in the 18th century. Certainly, you think of the British, the Prussians, the Dutch earlier on with platoon firing. French musketry it's not bad, but it's not famous world over. Do you instead harness the élan vital of the French people and charge home with cold steel and win your battles that way? And yes, you could do that by reissuing pikes, but equally you can do that by forming up in column with a musket and bayonet. And the great thing about a musket and a bayonet is you can shoot with it and you can stab people with it. You insist on the pike, then obviously you're limiting. You're limiting yourself purely to shock action, which I don't think anybody was seriously suggesting in this era for sort of European peer-on-peer warfare. Possibly a case with the Turks we could come back to, but so no, I think there's a desire to bring impetus into warfare. Alex, you mentioned Matthew Spring in a previous question whether there's even sort of links with some of the British volley and charge tactics later on in the century that perhaps you might want to pick up on. I know there's this idea that if troops go in with loaded muskets and they stop to fire, it's hard to get them going again, and that's there'd be a reason why if they can't fire at all, the pike is better possibly. But I mean, I would say the answer to that is take flints out. Just ask General Grey. Battler Powley, goes through the rest of his career as no Flint's Grey, although I'm sure you guys probably called him some other interesting names as well. So yeah, I think pikes as a major weapon for 18th century battlefields, no, I don't take it as a serious suggestion personally. I said there's the Austrian, Alex, I'm sure you'll correct my pronunciation and tell me more about this, but the Schweinfeder, I think something like that.
Right,
This was a type thing that they were still using against the Turks a little bit later than the true pike went out of fashion, but that's horses for courses to an extent. It's not the norm, and I don't know a great deal more about it, to be honest. I'm hoping you can jump in at that point and bail me out.
Yeah, so I would say, just kind of broadly, my answer to this would be you do see it. You see recommendations for it from the French theorists, which we mentioned in the question. Famed American Field Marshal Benjamin Franklin advocates for the reintroduction of both the pike and the longbow. This will be how the best armies would be raised and trained. I might get Ben Franklin's advice on how to have a cool time in Paris. I don't know that I would be taking his tactical recommendations. But with that said, the pike. There's a quote that I love, and it's in my book that came out in January from the Georg von Bernost. He's a Napoleonic. He's normally associated with the Napoleonic era, but he's a young aide and staff officer on Frederick the Great's staff, and he's kind of commenting on the amount of neoclassicism or like neoclassical thought in the 18th century world, because obviously. What is all this happening in the context of? I mean, what is Maurice de Saxe reading? I mean, he's reading about Hannibal and Alexander the Great and Pyrrhus of Ypres and all of these different classical figures, Scipio and Hannibal at Zama, and the pike is there, and the pike is like how the classics fought. So that's among elites that's part of this. This milieu of wanting to imitate the heroes. Would it be more manly if we fought close up and hand to hand? And Bernost literally addresses this sort of military neoclassicist thought that you see in one of his writings, and he says, "Remember, you are not Spartans, and our world reeks of gunpowder." So with respect to the great Molon Labe culture in the United States today, we can admire the classics and sort of want to draw lessons from the classical world, but that doesn't mean we can ignore current military technologies in doing so. I would say Maurice de Saxe's, probably not at his best when he's arguing for the reintroduction of pikes. Is there something to this idea of we want to move across the battlefield quickly and get in the enemy's grill and drive them off the battlefield? Yes, absolutely, I think there is. I mean, otherwise, the Guapa attacks of the Swedish army in the Great Northern War would not have been so successful. To some extent, I think that's one of the reasons why the British army is so successful in the sort of their battlefield attacks of the War of Independence. I mean, sort of picture it. Close your eyes, picture it for a second. You're marching across an open field at a slow pace with your musket at the shoulder, getting shot at. It doesn't take much for you to say, "Okay, my musket's at the shoulder. I'm going to bring it to the sort of the present and pop off here." Whereas if you're at a jog at the trail, and you get second rank behind you jogging, if you stop to fire, I mean, it's really going to gum up the whole works. And so momentum, the way you carry the musket are effective ways, at least I think in the British case, of trying to get around this psychological tendency of the men to fire. Whereas saying, let's give you a 16-foot long spear and point you at the enemy. I think there's a reason probably why this is not widely readopted. I mean, Christopher Duffy says that the length of Prussian NCO partisans is an effort to try and bring pikes back in the mid 18th century. But again, it's the NCOs only who are getting issued these. It's probably a bit of both, right? I mean, the cold steel, the morale shock aspect of these wars. They are important, but we live in the real world, and it's looking at it from a oh my gosh, I'm whiffing here live. But what's the name, Lee, of the Dave Grossman, the sort of theorist on sort of training soldiers to actually fire, not sort of sort of not fire the weapons. It's easier psychologically to fire at muzzle flashes 150 yards away than it is to go and drive a piece of wood or piece of metal into someone's body at very, very close range. And so as a result, the soldiers often prefer firepower as a weapon.
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. We're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode. All right, awesome. So our next question comes from Columbia, Missouri, and they say that they love the podcast. Thank you so much. But they've got a question about essentially logistics. How are these armies funded? How are their materials produced? And how has it all gotten to the soldier out on campaign or on the battlefield?
You want to tell us about the military fiscal system, Andrew?
I was rather hoping you would, to be honest, because I've said most of what I know about logistics in answer to the earlier question.
Indeed. Okay, so that sounds good. Just briefly, and then I'll kick it back over to you. So I would say Britain does have a marked advantage in sort of this sphere as a result of the sort of the banking system and sort of the credit that is available to the British government at this time, and Brewer has talked about this in a book called John Brewer, The Sinews of Power, The Sinews of War, I think, one of those two, where essentially he looks at the development of the British way of war and the sort of financial sort of loan system that backs up the British Army and the British Navy in these wars in the 18th century. I do think, I mean, you could to some extent put the Dutch in the same category, but I think the British are probably the leaders in this regard. For everyone else, you are essentially putting a huge amount of your national budget towards the military. And not to say the British aren't, but I mean, if you're looking at the expenditures of the French or the Prussians or the Russians, a sizable over 50% of the national budget is being spent specifically to fund the military, and so you're trying to essentially take the surplus via taxation from your population in order to put it into funding. The Prussians literally sort of build up big reserves of specie in order to sort of pay for things during wars. And in the reign of Frederick's father, who was sort of a famously tight-fisted guy, they developed this huge sort of excess and reserve savings of cash to basically spend on wars, and Frederick blows through all that by the time, of course, you get to the end of the 7 Years' War. So I mean, these wars are expensive. I think how it's produced and gotten to the battlefield, we've said a little bit about that already with the logistical system, the mobile ovens, the barges. This sounds like, and even in the listener's question, we might want to have a whole episode devoted to this. But most major states have a musket manufacturer. I mean, I obviously in Britain, Andrew, y'all have a couple, right? There's the Tower and Dublin, right? You have muskets produced in multiple locations, and cannons, I think, are also cast. Are they cast at Woolwich or are they cast at the Tower?
Yeah.
Okay.
You've got the Woolwich Arsenal, yeah. I don't think they were casting at the Tower. I mean, the Tower's a bit strange because a lot of the work was actually outsourced. You get sort of small scale private enterprise in the Tower Hamlets doing a lot of the gunsmithing. I was going to, you sort of came in at the same place I was thinking of. You've got your your more factory style setups, your Potsdams and your Saint Etiennes and your tools and so forth, where it's unusually, I suppose, that Britain's being a little bit more old fashioned on that one than some of the continental powers.
Yeah, and I do want to say, and I'm not going to remember the exact name of the book, so maybe we can put it in the show notes. But there's a book on sort of the British Empire and sort of gun manufacturing in the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries that has come out in the last 5 years. That is it's like a doorstop, sort of examining this process. Most countries have something like this, right? So, I mean, Andrews obviously mentioned Potsdam. In Austria, sometimes they're made near Speyer. I mean, I think a couple of locations there. Even small states. In Western Germany, the Hessians have a lot of muskets produced in the region around Schmalkalden. The Russians have an armory at Tula, which is a today, if you visitors who maybe have the chance to travel abroad in Russia, there's an absolutely enormous museum of Russian firearms in the city of Tula, even down to this day. It's well worth checking out. Maybe we'll do a whole episode on this one in the future, Andrew. Unless there's anything more pressing you want to say on this point.
No, I don't think so. It feels like something we probably need to get a guest expert in and really
absolutely
bounce around ourselves.
So I actually have a follow-up question on that one. Do you see there's the famous quote of amateurs study tactics and masters study logistics. Do you see that as an attitude in the 18th century among commanders, or not really?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I always, someone who's just written a book on infantry tactics, I think I'm a professional, but hey, it is what it is. Frederick famously says an army marches on its stomach, and this is something that is one of Americans. Nathaniel Green writes this in tons of letters to junior officers. So he's laser focused on logistical issues. As far as, I mean, the organization producing all this, what America does in the war, I think, is very impressive because we kind of do it on the fly. There's not a huge system of magazines present in America, like there is in Prussia or France or Austria or Russia at the start of the 7 Years' War. We have to kind of build up a military infrastructure system, and we've been doing that through committees of correspondence in small ways throughout the war. I mean, it's one of the reasons why those cannons were stolen out of Boston, in the period right before Lexington conquered, right? But I guess I would say, at the end of the day, money doesn't always win wars. Logistics don't always win wars, because if money and logistics and numbers always win wars, then the Prussians would have lost the 7 Years' War. The Ukrainians already would have lost the war in Ukraine going on today. I mean, if it's just a matter of logistical support, the size of armies, there's absolutely kind of an important morale and kind of tactical and operational aspect to these wars. I was on a podcast with a war gamer in Britain, Henry Hyde, on Friday, and we were talking a little bit about the American Army and the War of Independence. And I did kind of note, we lose battles like Germantown and Eutaw Springs, not because our guys run away, but because we run out of ammunition in the course of the attack. That's a logistical problem. At the Battle of Germantown, common soldiers are streaming past George Washington, and they're holding up empty cartridge boxes like, "Hey boss, we're out of ammo, see ya." So this is this is absolutely a vital part of the military art. But if you're, and again, no offense to the loggy guys out there. I mean, it's an absolute, like, it's not like, oh, this is the boring part of war. It's absolutely like a vital leg of a stool with tactics that kind of keeps the whole the whole system going. You can't. The British Army, they probably have an edge on this in the War of Independence. they have a sort of a tactical edge as well. They don't do as well as they do in the War of Independence without either of those advantages. So yeah, I don't think it's as simple as saying tactics is something that, like, your uncle reads about the size of the Tiger tank weapon barrel in World War II, and like logistics is really what the real historians and military men focus on. Both groups focus on both. I mean, logistics is incredibly important. Tactics, I mean, if you don't think tactics are important and like changes in tactics are important, I mean, imagine us having this conversation in the year 2000 and just the way that drones have changed the tactical landscape since in the last 25 years. I mean, that in and of itself, developments of technology, developments of tactics, they do change war, and they're worthy of serious study.
So our next question is from AJ Zism, 1993 at redacted.com. I have a question about cavalry. I get the impression that in the 18th century in Europe, trends mostly in light cavalry were set by nations from Eastern and Central Europe, such as Hungarians or Poles. Do you guys agree with that opinion? And if so, why?
I think we've got to be careful on this. Does cavalry become lighter because we bring in Eastern European light cavalry, or is there a recognition that cavalry needs to get lighter and we go and look at the people who are doing it and we import them in the same way we might import Highlanders or from the military frontier as light infantry? I'm inclined to say it's importing specialists. Heavy cavalry loses most of its armour. We're still talking about breastplates at least, but cavalry as a whole lightens. Armies become more mobile. The small wall becomes more important. Britain, I would say, is probably the only army that doesn't follow the trends until a lot later. They have their own light dragoon regiment. I suppose the Austrian Chevaulegers are something similar a little bit later that they have as distinct from hussars. How much of it as well is actually adopting anything more than the dress and the trappings? I'm not sure. I mean, lancers, the Saxons have some Polish Uhlans. The Prussians, I think, have the Bosniaks. Have I said that right, Alex?
Bosniaks, yeah indeed. Yeah.
But I mean, we're talking about a regiment. I think they're not really a big thing in. I don't think any. Well, the Russian Cossacks, I suppose, would be maybe the exception, but they're sort of irregulars, a different stamp again. Hussars, yeah. Again, I mean, how many of them are really the original Hungarian exiles, other than the actual Hungarians fighting for the Habsburgs? Your French and your Prussian Hussars. They follow them in name, and they certainly follow them in style and military fashion. And until you get the ridiculous Victorian version of hussar dress that bears very little resemblance to what was being worn by the first hussar regiments in the early 18th century. So no, I would personally say it's a recognition cavalry needs to get lighter, or light cavalry is needed, whichever way you want to look at that. Maybe a combination of both. And if we've got specialists we can import, or exiles we can borrow, then that works. And after that, it's a case of adopting the styles and the fashion rather than necessarily the actual literal substance of it, I think.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with Andrew broadly, and I do think basically it comes down to this sort of martial race theory that we've talked about a little bit, perhaps already on the podcast. You want your Prussians to be training the infantry. You want to import Highlanders. Whether you're the French or the Dutch or other armies. I mean, Central Europeans have been hiring Eastern European light cavalry all the way back into the 30 Years' War period. So I guess I would say, do the states in East, Central, and Eastern Europe have proportionally more light cavalry? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just look at Poland and Hungary and the area in Ukraine, and it's flatter, right, and larger, and you got to cross more territory. I mean, the Polish army has had more cavalry in it proportionally all the way back into the 17th century. So yeah, I don't know. Like Andrew, I guess I would say, does simply making everyone style their hair in like cool braids on either side of your head and like putting them in a a sort of a busby make them like equally good Hungarian like cavalry? Probably not. But again, you're trying to kind of embrace, I think, this martial race theory. um as we've said, there's there's an element to wanting to embrace the trappings uh, in the world of military fashion. That doesn't mean, you know, are Hungarians probably better like cavalrymen than plowboys from the Midlands? Yeah, probably. That doesn't mean that most armies don't have light cavalry regiments, and much like in the terms of light infantry. I think the War of Austrian Succession, and perhaps even earlier, you have this kind of fad for light infantry and light cavalry that's kind of sweeping across European armies at this time.
The impression that I'm getting is there's this martial race theory. Are we saying that it's a great thing to self-identify as a great and powerful race, but in reality, it's probably doesn't hold a lot of validity? Is that what we're saying? Or
Yeah,
is that...
so okay. If I was gonna fight in the mountains, I would probably want like Croats from the Militagranza to come do that with me. If I was gonna fight as like cavalry, I would probably want Hungarians or Poles to come and do that with me. If I was gonna go fight against Magua, I would want Daniel Day-Lewis to be there with me, right? I mean, like there are different military cultures that are evolving across the 18th century European world. Does that always mean that even in the situations that they are amazing at, these military cultures are always going to be like successful and like a trump card that beats everyone else? No. I mean, there are examples of outnumbered Prussian regular infantry regiments surviving attacks by like Croats that outnumber them 4-1. Do American riflemen always hit their targets? Well, there's Timothy Murphy and also the 17 riflemen that take 25 shots at General Webster as he crosses the Yadkin River in North Carolina and all miss. So, yeah, martial races are like, again, is it a thing? Is it not a thing? Like, I don't want to discount like the speciality and lived experience of these actual people and the skill sets that they do actually have. Sometimes I think we treat this almost in like a shamanistic way and say, oh, we're gonna summon up the spirit of the American long rifleman and he's gonna kill the British officer, or we're gonna have the Polish light cavalryman and he's gonna harry the Prussian infantry regiment into oblivion. Like, yeah, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so just I like looking at things through sort of like essentialist terms doesn't always give you the maybe desired outcome, even if it's part of the ingredients that maybe you need.
Gotcha.
Does that answer it?
It does, yeah. It does.
I'm not knocking the spirit of the American long rifleman, okay? I'm just saying that right now. Yeah. But I would say it's up there in terms of how we think about martial races, even today, as we look back at this period.
I think the point about the trends, isn't it? Putting somebody in a hunting shirt does not make them a marksman. Putting somebody in a police does not make them an excellent light cavalryman. So but once it becomes importing specialists to sort of cargo cult copying of if they look the part, they'll act the part. Well, of course they won't. I mean, the Prussian hussars get kicked around fairly comprehensively until they work out what they're actually going to be doing. So it's it takes more than a costume.
As a rejoinder, I will say they do look super fly, though. So
they look brilliant. Oh, absolutely.
All right. Moving on to our next one. This one's from Julius, and this one is for you, Alex, and it's about the American Revolution. How do you think foreign officers influenced the development of the American Army in tactics, organization? Were they modeled on the British, or did the presence of German, French, or Poles have any impact? I think you're at the right university.
Too. Let's not. Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. I am. Yes, the Baron is the mascot here. So, I guess, Yeah, mainly they're modeled on the British and the French because like that's the milieu of cultures that are impacting the development of American martial culture. I think we literally just talked about it, unless I guess we were going to edit it differently. We literally just talked about the impact of like a distinctly American culture in terms of dress and the hunting shirt, and maybe in some small ways that's a kind of interaction with native societies. I mean, those also play a role. In terms of the development of the Continental Army, I think all these groups play a role, right? I mean, we give Steuben a lot of credit because I think personally he deserves a lot of it, but um, General Conway is there before Steuben and is trying to teach the Americans things like displaying into line, or you sort of forming off the line of march that the Prussians called the deployieren. Right? I mean, there are different things. Again, it can be easy to essentialize and say, oh, Steuben appeared on the scene and then everything was better. Well, the Americans were essentially using British, sort of tactics from the 1760s before that point. There's a lot of learning on the job from a variety of sources. And by the end of the war, there are Americans, and I do think to some extent Washington is in this group, who say, yeah, the Prussian stuff that we got from Steuben is nice. One officer calls it the stiff German tactic, but we really want to be sort of advancing at the trail like the British are, and sort of charging with bayonets at the trail like they do. This is the highest form of war in Washington's mind. Just using firepower and not threatening your enemy with bayonets. This is a mark I think in Washington's mind that, hey, maybe we are not quite as proficient as the British are. So yeah, they learned from all of these sources. I think mainly from the British, but I would not discount the role. Certainly, I mean, when I teach military history to my undergraduates, I have slides where I talk about the impact that German officers had, and French officers had, and Polish officers had. I mean, we don't talk about what ifs of Saratoga. I mean, it's Kukushko who's laying out a lot of the fortifications for us at Saratoga, right? I mean, there are impacts that a variety of these European military cultures have, and one of my favorite stories from the War of Independence, and of course the guy's name is flown out of my head, but there's a Hungarian officer who writes to Ben Franklin basically saying, hey, can I have a job like Steuben in the Continental Army? And it's Michael Kovacs, the Fabrici, or Michael Kovacs. So Kovacs writes to Franklin, and Franklin is fairly lingual. I mean, right? He speaks sort of English. He speaks French. He speaks Latin. Kovacs, likewise, he's a fairly sort of gifted guy linguistically. He speaks Hungarian, he speaks Croatian, he speaks German, but the only language they have in common is Latin. And so Kovacs writes Franklin a letter in Latin saying, hey, can I come join the Continental Army? And Franklin writes back in Latin saying, yeah, sure, we'll find a spot for you. Come on over, train our cavalry. And he is the second in command of Pulaski's Legion in the course of the War of Independence. So yeah, I don't think we should just say, we get everything from the British. Really, the Continental Army is part of military Europe with the international conglomerate of elite officers that being an army in military Europe entails.
Just to pick up on that last point, it struck me. It gets talked up a little bit. Maybe it's part of your national independence myth that that all these people like Lafayette and Steuben come over for love of the young republic, and I'm sure that's valid up to a point. But I mean, military Europe as a whole, there's so much cross pollination of doctrine between armies. You've got your Huguenot and your Jacobite exiles fighting for different countries. I'm trying to think of more examples now. It is mostly exiles, isn't it? Some of the soldiers of fortune perhaps who end up leading Frederick's Free Corps. But people, moving between armies is a thing, and sharing expertise is a thing. We were talking in a previous question, of course, about like cavalry experts from Eastern Europe. But yeah, even afterwards, I mean, John Paul Jones, I think I'm right in saying, having done his thing with the Continental Navy, goes off and fights for the Russians, I think it is. I thought he was a patriot, but it turns out he was a loyalist when I looked him up. Thompson, who goes off and remodels the Bavarian army and ends up as a Graf von Rumford, and invents a new helmet that's named after him. A loyalist who's obviously lost his place in America. So there is a transatlantic shift back again once you've won your war. That some of the expertise is percolated back into Europe.
Yeah, and I agree completely, Andrew. I think it probably varies person to person. How much these folks are invested in the cause of liberty. I think to some extent, Pulaski and Kukushko, they come over and think, let's sort of get a how-to manual for how to liberate our country from the Poles and from the Russians and the Austrians and the Prussians. I think de Kalb and Steuben both are kind of true believers. I mean, Steuben stays and becomes a citizen of the United States. De Kalb is, sort of writes a lot about, sort of he believes America is like this, Enlightenment project. Lafayette, he goes back to France when the war is done, right? He does not stay in America, even though I think he has a lot of fond memories and goes on several kind of like almost like reunion tours of America in the early 19th century. It probably varies from officer to officer, and I wish I could say it was like the really successful ones are true believers and the others are, the mercenaries kind of are chaff that falls to the side, but I don't think it's that simple. It's sort of there's a milieu, and some of the mercenaries are successful and some of the true believers are successful, and some others aren't. I always think of is it the Baron de Vodka, who is a Prussian cavalry major, cuirassier major, I think brigade major of the cuirassier, who comes to America. He essentially like a Steuben story, right? He's coming over from Prussia very early in the war, and ends up kind of drinking himself to death on the northern frontier in the course of the fallback from Canada in 1776. So again, there are a variety of outcomes. We remember the success stories. But I think probably for every one Baron Steuben that we remember, there's probably 5 or 6 Europeans who are like, this is not really for me. The food's bad. We're kind of in the wilderness here. What's going on? And that's part of the story of America too.
Awesome. And we have an episode where we kind of dig into this a little bit when we talk about Irish in French service, but we do touch on the idea of kind of shopping your martial skills around. Our next question is from Remus, Michigan, and they're talking about the mentality of Highlanders. So, Andrew, I think this is right up your alley. They're asking, why would Highlanders serve in an army where there's still a lot of animosity? I've never come across anyone who has had an insight as to why you would want to serve a standard that was so hard on your people and very likely your family within your living memory, meaning the Jacobite Rebellion of 45. So why would Highlanders want to fight in a British army?
Okay, there's quite a few layers to this. We've got some episodes coming up on the 45, so I'll not go into too much on that now. But one of the things to remember there is that there are already Highland regiments in the British Army before that happens. The regiment that ultimately becomes the Black Watch that survives to the present day as a battalion within the Royal Regiment of Scotland, and Loudon's Highlanders, who were disbanded at the end of the Austrian Succession War. There's also the Argyll Militia, which is Highlanders, Clan Campbell, fighting for George II. Several of the other clans stay loyal to the Hanoverian regime. They don't have anything to do with the Stuarts. A lot of Lowland Scots regiments in the British Army as well. And some of the nastier bits of the 45 are actually Scot versus Scot. There are old scores being settled, and yes, one of the parties is wearing King George's red coat. I'm not trying to absolve the British Army as an institution from some of the burnings and whatnot, but it's not infrequently the case that it's Scottish officers in red coats doing unpleasant things to fellow Scots. So that's a complicated situation in itself, and I think that all Highlanders came out of that with a hatred for the the Hanoverian regime and the English. That's probably a mischaracterization to begin with. If you then jump ahead to the 7 Years' War, when there's a plethora of new Highland regiments raised, there's a couple of things there. So one thing is to consider, why are people raising Highland regiments, in the sense of why are Scottish magnates saying, in effect, now then, King George, would you like me to raise my clan for you? Well, one of the key reasons is that if they back the wrong side in the 45, now the Stuarts are a busted flush. The Stuarts aren't coming back. So if you want to recover your lands and your influence in Scotland, you've got to make nice with the new regime, because they're staying. This is the direct line of monarchy that still continues. You've got to get in with the power that be. You might have to grit your teeth in doing so if you were a Jacobite before, but this is a reality of things. And if you want to show you're loyal and that your people are loyal, then raise a regiment. I mean, the brilliant example is Simon Fraser of Fraser's Highlanders, the 78th, who fight in Canada in the 7 Years' War. He'd been a Jacobite colonel. He dies a British general, but his father was Lord Lovat, who tried to back both sides, failed, and ended up losing his head on Tower Green. Stripped of his title and the rest of it. If the son wishes to rehabilitate Clan Fraser in the eyes of King George, then offering up a regiment is a pretty good way to do it, and that's what he does. And some of the officers, to an extent as well, certainly serving in the British Army is a good way of wiping away a stain if maybe dad or an uncle had come out for Charlie. So that's kind of why these regiments are raised. As to why you would serve in them, obviously the settlement after the 45 has done a lot to try and stamp out Highland culture. I mean, the extent to which that is the case is exaggerated, but certainly the concept of trying to crack down on the Highland dress and the bagpipes and all the rest of it, there's certainly an element of that. So, if you want to go to war wearing your plaid, marching behind the pipes, the only place you can do that now is King George's army. There's also an element that where the clan culture is still strong, if your chief's calling for men to join up, if he's raising a regiment, be that for Charlie in 45 or George in 57, if you're called and you say no, then you have a reasonable chance of having your house pulled down or burnt. You're certainly not going to be in the Laird's good books. So if there's a call for men, there's a certain amount of compulsion in that society anyway. But as I say, there's also that element. If you want to be a Highland soldier, that's the only way you can do it. For the regiments that are raised for North America, there's maybe the chance that you can go out and make a new life out there. I mean, we're not getting into Highland clearance territory yet, but the Highland way of life is perhaps beginning to wane. So chance for a new future somewhere else is an option as well. I mean, it's one of these things. It's unfortunate that the 45 in Highland culture gets romanticised and it gets picked up for political reasons, and I think we have to be careful not to let either Sir Walter Scott or modern Scottish politics influence the way we think of these soldiers. It's a complex situation. I've tried to outline some of my thoughts on it. I don't think there's a single motivation you could apply in any case. As I said, the inspiration for people raising and serving as officers is going to be different from the people serving in the ranks. But yeah, it's messy, and we'll hopefully unpick it some more when we do our series of episodes on the 45.
All right, our next question is from Jacob. And he's asking about followers, meaning the followers of the armies. How are they different in different armies? Cultural differences, difference in standards for who can and can't do it.
Sure. So I can start off on this one. I would say broadly, followers are an important part of all of the armies of military Europe. There are women following the army in sort of each of these military cultures, perhaps with variations between. I've looked at this a little bit on my blog. Maybe in the British Army, you're a little bit less likely. Okay, pause. In no European army are over 50% of the soldiery married. So soldiers' wives are an important part of this story, but it's not like every soldier has his wife coming with him in the army. So maybe that's a place to start. And likewise, I think it's worth saying our plan is to have an entire episode, much like logistics, much like the Jacobites, an entire episode, or a couple of episodes devoted to the question of women following the army in the 18th century. So we can give this subject the respect that it deserves. In no army, though, are more than 50% of the soldiers married. In the Prussian army, it's one of the sort of most married armies in the 18th century. About 30% of the soldiers are married. But even then, a lot of wives and families remain in sort of the garrisons when the soldiers march away to war, and only a few of them, or a minority, come on campaign. On campaign, women serve a lot of different vital roles. Obviously, sort of food preparation, logistical support for the army. We we talked about living off the land. Christopher Duffy has some absolutely incredible sort of descriptions of Prussian army women sort of following the Prussian army in the 18th century, and he says the Prussian generals claim it's not really the soldiers that are like breaking into peasants' houses and stealing things. It's actually the camp followers who are doing it, because they're basically what's going on is these guys, these women are looking for things to sell to the men, and so they are breaking open like basically ice houses and taking the ice out and sort of chopping it up and selling it to the men. There are a variety of ways in which women are both a vital logistical support for the army, and also to some extent a huge logistical headache for the army. And again, it depends kind of country to country how you view this. Women are at several points drummed out of the Continental Army camp for being prostitutes. Whereas in the Prussian army, Frederick's view is kind of almost like a reverse Scrooge. Prostitutes increase the population. Let's have more surplus population means more taxpayers, more wealth. Woohoo! We're creating more people for the state to tax. So it's a variety of different ways of looking at this. In most all 18th century armies, you have to apply to the government in order to get permission to marry as a soldier and a soldier's wife. And so sometimes these relationships will be sort of permanent legal unions following the armies. Sometimes these women will be sort of like sutleresses traveling with the armies, selling things. Sometimes they would be kind of sex workers traveling along with the army. So there are again, a variety of motivations, a variety of things, much like there's a huge range of motivations that lead men to join the army in the 18th century. There's a huge range of motivations that lead women to follow the armies in the 18th century.
All right, awesome. So those are all the questions we're going to have for this episode. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning, we've got a lot more, and we will be getting to them in other episodes. But we're going to move on to our Murmurs in the Camp section, and we actually picked a question from Julius, and we thought it was more of an opinion-based question, so we figured it'd be a great one for our Murmurs in the Camp section. And Julius asked, if you could be an aide-de-camp to one of the greatest commanders of the 18th century and witness their battles, which commander would you choose?
Andrew.
I'm tempted to say Maurice, of course, because I'm a fan, but I suspect that might be more for the parties afterwards than for the education in warfare. I'll go for a drink with the actresses after the fighting is done. I'm going to go early. Actually, I'm going to say Marlborough, and that's partly because I don't know as much about Marlborough's campaigns as I should. But what I'm increasingly getting the feeling is that the Marlboroughian army and the staff system that ran it were probably a lot more efficient than some of the later ones. I certainly get the feeling with the British Army that it all got forgotten and had to be relearned, and I'm sort of intrigued to see just how, I would say, arguably Britain's greatest general. He's up there with Wellington, certainly. Marlborough, Wellington and Slim are the top three for me, for sure. I'd like to see how he did it. So yeah, I'm going to say Marlborough.
Yeah, I think unsurprisingly for me, it's going to have to be a Prussian answer. Although there are so many great ones. I think either Johann Dietrich von Hulsen or Feldmarschall Christoph von Schwerin. Schwerin for much the same reasons that Andrew just listed, although I think a little bit more of an intellectual bent than maybe sort of fun party time. His sort of after day dinners and things like this was known for almost being kind of like a salon. There was a lot of men in the Enlightenment there present. I think that would be a fascinating thing to witness. Sort of like the soldier philosopher. The almost like the Jim Mattis of his age in some ways. I guess I would say both of these men appeal to me because they're both kind of later in life. They're in their, I mean, Schwerin was born in the 1690s. I think Dietrich von Hulsen he's certainly in his 60s during the 7 Years' War. So again, kind of a child, maybe the later 1690 decade. They've seen a lot of the period of history that I'm interested in, being able to kind of be there, sort of learning from the experiences, not just of the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, but also some of these earlier wars that Andrew mentioned they sort of experienced as young men. I think that would be a fascinating thing. Kind of that we always, I think of these figures in isolation, right? That kind of like Frederick is his own thing, and Maurice de Saxe is his own thing, and Prince Eugene and Marlborough. But a lot of these guys' lives overlapped, and they meet. I mean, Frederick and Eugene hang out for a few weeks in the course of the War of Polish Succession. So just being able to kind of draw on that experience with Hulsen or Schwerin sounds like a really great time.
So I think I've got to make things a little difficult here and choose a naval commander. I think naval commanders are so interesting. They have to have the tactical knowledge, the leadership ability, the attention to details. On top of all that, they've got their naval skill that they have to master in order to be successful. So specifically, I think I would want to be the aide de camp or the second lieutenant, third lieutenant of Admiral John Jarvis. He's most well known for his victory at the Battle of Cape St. Vincent in 1797, I believe it is. He's a super interesting character because, like most naval commanders, he does rise through the ranks and starts at a very young age. But for him specifically, he actually runs away when he's a little kid to join the Navy. He does come back, and he receives some patronage to get onto another ship and rises through the ranks that way. But he also has a point in his career where he's in debt, so he has to go back to being a common sailor to help pay that debt down. I think that's such a cool thing for this admiral or somebody who eventually becomes an admiral. He does time as a common sailor, the lowliest of the low, and then rises all the way up through the ranks to the highest levels of the British Navy. So that breadth of experience, I think, is super, super interesting. He also serves through multiple conflicts. He fights in the 7 Years' War. He's at the Battle of Quebec, where he initially kind of catches the eye of General Wolfe. He fights in the American Revolution, trying to keep French supplies from getting to America. And then he also fights in the Napoleonic Wars and does an enormous amount there, and he takes command of the Mediterranean fleet. So he does a huge amount of stuff. So I think he's such an interesting person, and I think it would be incredible to be able to serve on his ship and watch that kind of guy work. So John Jarvis, I think that's got to be my answer. So like we said before, we have a whole lot more questions. So if you did send us a question and we didn't get to it, don't worry, we will get to it. Our goal is to get to as many of these as we can, if not all of them. Thank you for sending in questions. If you have more questions, please send them in.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed us as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino, music by Brianna Tam, Ardi Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.